On November 3, 1982, David Mitchell, a 34-year-old analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, sat in his silver Honda Accord outside Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C., holding a medical file that would unravel everything he thought he knew about his marriage, his wife, and the previous 18 months of his life. The file, stamped with the hospital's letterhead and signed by Dr. Patricia Hammond, contained routine prenatal care records for his wife, Catherine Mitchell, except the conception date listed didn't align with any timeline that made sense. David had been deployed to West Germany for 3 months during the window when, according to the ultrasound measurements and hormone level documentation, their child had been conceived. He sat there in the parking garage, engine running, heat blasting against the November cold, staring at numbers that couldn't be reconciled. His wife was 12 weeks pregnant with a baby that, by every medical calculation, had been conceived while he was 4,000 miles away, analyzing Soviet troop movements at a NATO facility outside Frankfurt. What David couldn't have known, sitting in that car with his hands trembling against the steering wheel, was that the medical file would set into motion a counterintelligence investigation that would expose one of the most sophisticated honey trap operations the KGB had ever run on American soil, a network that had been active for nearly 5 years, and a betrayal that reached far deeper into the intelligence community. On November 3, 1982, David Mitchell sat in his silver Honda Accord in the underground parking garage of Georgetown University Hospital, the engine idling, heat blasting against the late autumn cold that had settled over Washington, D.C. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting pale yellow streaks across the hood of his car. He held a manila folder in his hands, the kind used for medical records, with Catherine's name typed neatly on a white label affixed to the front. Inside were prenatal care documents he'd picked up from the hospital's records department 20 minutes earlier, routine paperwork needed for their insurance claim. David was a methodical man by training and temperament. At 34, he'd spent the last 9 years working as an analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, stationed at the DIA headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, where he specialized in Soviet military capabilities and Warsaw Pact force structure. His job required precision, attention to detail, an ability to synthesize fragmentary intelligence into coherent assessments that informed Pentagon planning and NATO strategy. It was this same methodical nature that had made him pause in the parking garage rather than drive home immediately, this same instinct that had prompted him to open the folder and scan the documents before filing them away. The first page was standard: patient information, insurance details, primary care physician listed as Dr. Patricia Hammond. The second page contained the initial prenatal examination notes from October 20th, 1982. Catherine had gone to the appointment alone, mentioning it casually over dinner that evening, saying everything looked fine, the baby was healthy, due date projected for late May or early June. Now, sitting in the car with the folder open across his steering wheel, David studied the examination notes more carefully. Dr. Hammond had recorded the date of Catherine's last menstrual period as August 10, 1982. Based on that date and the ultrasound measurements taken during the examination, the estimated conception date was listed as August 24th, give or take 3 days in either direction. The gestational age was calculated at 12 weeks and 2 days as of the examination date. David read the numbers twice, then a third time. August 24th, 1982. He felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest, a sensation like ice water spreading through his veins. He reached into his briefcase on the passenger seat and pulled out his pocket calendar, a small leather-bound planner he carried everywhere, marked with appointments, meetings, travel dates. He flipped back to August, running his finger down the entries. August 15th through September 30th were marked in red ink, TDY, Germany. Temporary duty assignment. He'd been deployed to a NATO facility outside Frankfurt for 6 weeks, conducting analysis on Soviet armored divisions in East Germany, living in transient quarters at Rhine-Main Air Base, working 12-hour days in a secure facility that processed classified intelligence from signals intercepts and human sources operating behind the Iron Curtain. He checked the dates again, comparing the calendar entries to the conception window indicated in the medical records. August 24th fell squarely in the middle of his deployment. He'd been in West Germany, 4,000 miles from Washington, working in a classified facility where every movement was logged, every communication monitored, every moment of his day accounted for in security protocols designed to prevent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. David sat very still, the engine humming, the heater blowing warm air across his face. Outside, a car pulled into a parking space 3 rows away. A woman got out carrying grocery bags, walked toward the elevator without glancing in his direction. The fluorescent light above his car flickered again, buzzed faintly, then steadied. He thought about the phone call he'd made to Catherine on August 24th. He'd called from the secure facility's communication center, a brief 10-minute conversation on a line that was almost certainly monitored. She sounded tired, mentioned she was busy with coursework for her graduate program at Georgetown, where she was pursuing a master's degree in linguistics with a focus on Russian language and Soviet literature. He told her about the work, the long hours, how much he missed her. She'd said she missed him too, that she loved him, that she couldn't wait for him to come home. David had returned to Washington on October 2nd. They'd made love that first night, exhausted but happy to be together after 6 weeks apart. He'd assumed that was when Catherine had conceived, early October, a timeline that would have made sense given the pregnancy announcement in mid-October. But the medical records told a different story. The records said conception had occurred in late August, while he was in Germany analyzing Soviet tank formations, and she was in Washington supposedly attending graduate seminars. He tried to find an alternative explanation. Could the conception date be wrong? Medical dating wasn't an exact science. Ultrasound measurements could vary. Menstrual cycles weren't always perfectly regular. But Dr. Hammond's notes were detailed, professional, based on standard obstetric protocols. The measurements were precise: crown rump length, gestational sac dimensions, hormone levels. The numbers all pointed to the same conclusion. David pulled out a small notebook from his briefcase and began writing dates. He listed his deployment departure, August 15th. He listed his return, October 2nd. He listed the conception window from the medical records, August 21st through August 27th. He worked backward, calculating, recalculating, trying to find any scenario where the timeline made sense. There wasn't one. He thought about asking Catherine directly, showing her the records, demanding an explanation. But even as the thought formed, he dismissed it. If there was an innocent explanation, something medical he didn't understand, she would have mentioned it already. If there wasn't an innocent explanation, confronting her without more information would be a mistake. She would deny it or lie or create some story he couldn't immediately verify. David had been trained to analyze intelligence, to evaluate sources, to construct pictures of adversary capabilities based on fragmentary evidence. He knew that the first rule of intelligence work was never to reveal what you knew until you understood the full scope of the situation. Premature action could compromise an investigation, alert targets, allow networks to disperse. He put the medical records back in the folder, closed it carefully, and set it on the passenger seat. Then he sat in the car for another 10 minutes, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of discovery pressing down on him. Outside, the parking garage remained mostly empty. A few cars scattered across the concrete expanse. overhead lights casting long shadows between support columns. Catherine was pregnant. That much was certain. But the baby, according to every calculation he could make, every piece of medical evidence in the file, had been conceived while he was 4,000 miles away, working in a secure facility in West Germany, surrounded by classified intelligence on Soviet military operations. David started the car, put it in gear, and drove slowly up the ramp toward street level. November darkness had already fallen across the city, streetlights glowing orange against the early evening sky. He turned right onto Reservoir Road, joining the flow of traffic heading toward their apartment in Arlington, across the Potomac, past the Pentagon where lights burned in windows overlooking the river. He would verify everything first. He would reconstruct the timeline with absolute precision, eliminate any possibility of error. He would check his travel orders, his security logs from the Germany deployment, his credit card statements showing purchases made overseas during the relevant dates. He would gather evidence methodically, systematically, the way he'd been trained. The baby couldn't be his. The mathematics were inescapable, which meant Catherine had been with someone else during his deployment, which meant his wife, who had access to his home office, who knew his work schedule, who understood he held a top-secret security clearance and analyzed classified Soviet intelligence, had betrayed him. David gripped the steering wheel tighter and drove through the November darkness toward home. For 3 days, David Mitchell moved through his life like a man underwater, performing the motions of normalcy while his mind worked constantly in the background, re-examining everything he thought he knew about his marriage. He went to work at DIA headquarters, sat through briefings on Soviet SS-20 missile deployments, drafted assessments on Warsaw Pact readiness postures, spoke in measured tones about strategic implications, while part of his consciousness remained elsewhere, reviewing the previous 18 months frame by frame. Catherine seemed unchanged. She came home from her graduate seminars at Georgetown, made dinner, talked about her thesis research on Soviet dissident literature, asked about his day in the careful way spouses of intelligence officers learned to ask, never pressing for details about classified work. She complained about morning sickness. She made plans for Thanksgiving. She seemed exactly as she had been, but David was no longer watching with the same eyes. He had married Catherine Russo in June 1980, a quiet ceremony in her hometown outside Philadelphia, followed by a small reception at a country club. She'd been 24 then, fresh from completing her undergraduate degree in Russian literature at Georgetown, planning to pursue graduate work. David had been 32, already established at DIA, already holding the security clearances that would define the boundaries of their life together. They'd met through mutual friends at a Georgetown bookstore event, started dating, discovered they shared interests in history and languages. The marriage had been good, David thought, stable, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Catherine was intelligent, independent, absorbed in her academic work. David was focused on his career, often working late, sometimes traveling for temporary assignments. They'd talked about starting a family, agreed they wanted children, decided to let it happen naturally. Now, David tried to pinpoint when things had changed. His deployment to Germany had run from August 15th through September 30th, 1982. 6 weeks. Before he'd left, everything had seemed normal. Catherine had been busy with summer coursework, preparing for the fall semester. She'd driven him to Dulles Airport, kissed him goodbye, promised to write. The letters had arrived regularly at Rhine-Main Air Base, forwarded through military postal channels. David still had them, stored in a box in the closet. He'd brought the box to work, locked in his desk drawer, and during lunch he pulled them out and reread them chronologically. August 19th. Missing you already. The apartment feels empty. spent all day in the library working on my thesis chapter about Solzhenitsyn's narrative structure. August 26th. Getting together with some classmates this weekend to study. There's a new student in the program, Victor, visiting scholar from some cultural exchange program. Very intense about Russian formalist theory. September 2nd. Study group. Went well. We're meeting weekly now. Victor knows an incredible amount about Soviet literary history. He actually lived in Moscow until 2 years ago. September 9th. Victor invited our study group to a lecture at the Soviet Embassy about cultural exchange programs. I know you wouldn't approve, but it's purely academic. Some of us are going this Friday. David read that letter again, feeling something cold crystallize in his chest. The Soviet Embassy. Catherine had gone to the Soviet Embassy while he was deployed, analyzing classified intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. She'd mentioned it casually, framed as an academic event, something she knew he wouldn't approve, but presented as harmless. He'd never responded to that detail. He'd probably dismissed it, trusted her judgment, assumed Georgetown professors supervised these events. Now he saw it differently. September 16th mentioned another study group meeting. September 23rd talked about research requiring primary source materials at the Library of Congress. September 30th expressed excitement about his return. David closed the box and sat at his desk. The DIA Analysis Center hummed with activity around him. Analysts studying maps, typing reports, speaking in low voices about classified assessments. The room was windowless, artificially lit, temperature-controlled, designed to be secure. He thought about Catherine's behavior after his return from Germany. She'd seemed genuinely happy to see him, affectionate, engaged, but there had been small changes he'd noticed but not questioned. She'd become more social, attending more evening events at Georgetown, joining discussion groups. She'd taken weekend trips to New York twice in October, explaining them as research visits to Columbia University's library. David had encouraged these trips. He'd thought it was healthy for her to have her own pursuits. Now he wondered who she'd actually been meeting in New York. He remembered coming home early one afternoon in late October. Catherine had been on the phone in the bedroom, speaking Russian. She'd ended the call quickly when she heard him, emerged smiling, explained it was language practice with another graduate student. David spoke enough Russian for his work to know she'd been speaking fluently, comfortably, beyond simple grammar exercises. But he'd accepted her explanation without question. There had been phone calls that ended when he entered rooms, explanations about study groups that filled her evenings 2 or 3 times per week, a new interest in his work schedule, casual questions about when he'd be traveling next, whether he was working on anything particularly demanding. David had interpreted these as wifely concern, normal curiosity. He'd never violated his clearances by discussing classified details, but he'd mentioned general things, that he was busy with Soviet military analysis, that tensions with Moscow were high, that the intelligence community was focused on Warsaw Pact capabilities. Had she been passing that information to someone? Even general details, combined with knowledge of his schedule, his access, his clearances, could be valuable to a foreign intelligence service. David pulled out another notebook, this one new, purchased at a drugstore. He began documenting everything he could remember from the previous 18 months. He listed dates, events, Catherine's absences, her unexplained activities. He wrote down names. Victor, the visiting scholar. Professor Delaney, her thesis advisor. Classmates whose names appeared in conversation. He worked methodically, building a timeline, identifying gaps, marking inconsistencies. By the 3rd day, David had filled 20 pages with notes. The picture emerging was fragmentary but disturbing. Catherine had changed during his Germany deployment. She'd developed new social connections, begun attending events at the Soviet embassy, started making trips away from Washington. She'd become more interested in his work, more attuned to his schedule. And she'd become pregnant during a window when he was verifiably 4,000 miles away. The pregnancy could be explained by infidelity alone, a personal betrayal, devastating but contained. But the other elements, the Soviet connections, the interest in his work, suggested something potentially more sinister. Catherine had access to their apartment, where David sometimes brought home briefing materials in locked cases. She knew his security protocols, his clearances, his analytical focus. If she'd been compromised by Soviet intelligence, the damage could extend far beyond personal betrayal. David knew what he had to do. This wasn't something he could investigate alone. His security clearance required him to report any circumstance that could represent a vulnerability to foreign intelligence exploitation. A spouse's infidelity, particularly involving potential contact with Soviet nationals, fell squarely within that requirement. On the evening of November 6th, David sat at the kitchen table after Catherine had gone to bed, claiming exhaustion. He pulled out his work notebook and wrote a single name: James Callahan. His supervisor at DIA, a career intelligence officer who'd worked Soviet analysis since the 1960s, who understood the implications of security compromises, who would know exactly what protocols to follow. David would make the call Monday morning. He would report his suspicions through proper channels, initiate whatever investigation was necessary. But first, he sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the November wind rattle the windows, feeling the weight of what was coming. He thought about the baby growing inside Catherine, the child who couldn't be his, the pregnancy that had forced him to see patterns he'd willfully ignored. Somewhere in Washington, someone knew the truth about Catherine Mitchell. Someone had recruited her, trained her, directed her activities. Someone had sent her to the Soviet embassy, arranged her, contacts, exploited her access to a DIA analyst. David closed his notebook and sat in the darkness, waiting for Monday. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The first real bite of winter settling over Washington as David Mitchell drove to DIA headquarters in Arlington. The sky hung low and colorless over the Potomac, and thin drizzle misted across his windshield as he crossed the river, the Pentagon's massive outline visible through the rain. He'd left the apartment early before Catherine woke, leaving a note about an early meeting. James Callahan's office was on the 4th floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the parking lots, and, beyond them, Northern Virginia suburbs stretching toward the capital. Callahan was 58, a career intelligence officer who'd started in Army intelligence during Korea and transitioned to DIA when the agency was established in 1961. He specialized in Soviet military analysis, had testified before Congress, and maintained institutional knowledge that made him invaluable during crises. He was also David's direct supervisor. David arrived at 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes before Callahan typically came in. He waited in the hallway, holding the folder he'd prepared over the weekend. Copies of medical records, deployment orders, timeline reconstruction, notes on Catherine's behavioral changes. When Callahan appeared at 7:30, carrying a briefcase and coffee from the cafeteria, David stepped forward. "Jim, I need to speak with you privately. It's a security matter." Callahan's expression shifted immediately, casual greeting replaced by professional alertness. He unlocked his office door, gestured David inside, closed the door, pulled the shade down over the hallway window. These were automatic motions, ingrained by decades of handling sensitive information. "What's happened?" Callahan asked. David laid the folder on Callahan's desk and began talking. He spoke calmly, methodically, presenting information in the structured way he'd been trained to brief intelligence findings. He started with the medical records, explained the conception date impossibility, detailed his Germany deployment dates. Then he moved to Catherine's behavioral changes, her contacts with Soviet embassy personnel, her unexplained absences. Callahan listened without interrupting, his face expressionless in the way senior intelligence officers learn to control reactions. He opened the folder, read through the medical records, examined David's timeline. When David finished, Callahan sat back and was quiet for nearly a minute. "You haven't confronted her about any of this?" Callahan asked finally. "No, sir. I thought it needed to be reported first, given my clearances and her potential contacts." Callahan nodded slowly. "You did the right thing. This goes beyond a domestic matter." He picked up his phone, dialed an internal extension. "I need you in my office immediately. Security matter." He hung up and looked at David. "Wait here." 10 minutes later, Laura Vance from DIA's security office entered. Callahan briefed her quickly. Vance asked David several questions, taking notes on a legal pad. How long had he known about the pregnancy? When had he discovered the timeline discrepancy? What were Catherine's exact contacts with Soviet embassy personnel? After 30 minutes, Vance stood. "This needs to go to FBI counterintelligence immediately. Given Mr. Mitchell's clearances and access, this represents a potential compromise situation." By noon, David was sitting in a conference room at the FBI's Washington field office on Buzzard Point. The room was small and windowless, with pale green walls and a government-issue table. 2 FBI agents sat across from him. Special Agent Robert Tennant, mid-40s, wearing a dark suit and carrying himself with careful neutrality, and Special Agent Diana Morse, younger, sharp-eyed, taking notes. Tennant led the interview, going through David's story again from the beginning, asking for additional details, clarifying timelines, probing for information David might have initially forgotten or dismissed. The session lasted 3 hours. When Tennant returned from making phone calls, his demeanor had shifted, become more focused. "Mr. Mitchell, we're going to open a formal counterintelligence investigation into your wife's activities. I need you to understand several things." David nodded. "First, you cannot discuss this with anyone, including your wife. You'll continue your normal domestic routine exactly as before. No changes in behavior, no confrontations. Can you do that?" "Yes," David said. "Second, we'll be conducting surveillance on your wife starting immediately. We'll monitor her movements, contacts, communications. This may take time. You need to be prepared for that." "I understand." Tennant leaned forward. "Third, if your wife is involved in espionage activities, she may not be working alone. We need to identify her full network, her handlers, her contacts. If we move too quickly, if she's alerted, others will disappear. That's why your role is essential. You're our window into her daily life." David felt the weight of what Tennant was describing. He would go home to Catherine, sleep beside her, eat meals with her, maintain the fiction while FBI agents watched. "Can you do this?" Tennant asked. "Yes," David said. The surveillance began that afternoon. FBI technical teams installed monitoring equipment on the phone line to the Mitchell apartment, obtained court authorization for wiretaps, positioned surveillance vehicles in the neighborhood. Teams began following Catherine, documenting her movements, photographing everyone she met. Within 48 hours, patterns emerged. Catherine attended her graduate seminars at Georgetown on schedule, but twice that week she left campus and drove to locations unrelated to academic work. On Tuesday evening, she met a man at a coffee shop in DuPont Circle. FBI surveillance photographed him. Late 30s, dark hair, well-dressed. He spoke with Catherine for 90 minutes over coffee, then walked with her to her car before they separated. Tennant showed David the photographs on Friday, November 12th. "Do you recognize this man?" David studied the images. The man looked vaguely European, his clothing slightly formal by American standards. "No, I've never seen him." "His name is Viktor Sokolov," Tennant said. "He's listed as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. He's been in Washington for 18 months. We've had him flagged as suspected GRU since his arrival." GRU. Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie, Soviet military intelligence. Catherine mentioned someone named Victor in her letters, David said quietly, a visiting scholar. Tennant nodded. "That's his cover. He poses as an academic, attends university events. Standard recruitment platform. He identifies potential targets, cultivates relationships, assesses vulnerabilities." The FBI showed David additional surveillance photographs. Catherine meeting Sokolov at a park in Maryland, walking along a trail, sitting on a bench. No study materials visible. "We're documenting everything," Tennant said. "Her meetings with Sokolov, her movements, her calls. We've also initiated background investigations on all her contacts. We're building a comprehensive picture." Over the following weeks, that picture became clearer. FBI surveillance revealed Catherine was meeting Sokolov approximately twice per week, always at different locations, always using graduate school explanations to David. The FBI captured footage of Catherine leaving late one evening while David slept, driving to a 24-hour diner in Virginia where she met Sokolov at 2 a.m. Tennant showed David the footage. Watching his pregnant wife meet a GRU officer in the middle of the night, David felt something fundamental crack inside him. "We've also found evidence of document handling," Tennant said. He showed David photographs. Catherine carrying a manila envelope into one meeting with Sokolov, leaving without it. Sokolov photographed later entering the Soviet embassy. "What kind of documents?" David asked. "We don't know, specifically, but given your access, we have to assume she's been photographing materials from your home office. Do you bring classified briefing materials home?" "Sometimes," David admitted. "Locked in a security case. It's authorized." "Does she have access to your office?" "It's in our apartment. I locked the case, but she could—" David stopped, realizing the implication. The FBI began a damage assessment, reviewing everything David had worked on for 18 months. The scope was staggering. Soviet military capabilities assessments, Warsaw Pact readiness reports, signal intelligence, human intelligence from sources behind the Iron Curtain. By early December, the FBI had documented 17 meetings between Catherine and Sokolov. They'd identified her pattern of document handling, her use of tradecraft protocols suggesting training in clandestine operations. They'd traced her New York trips and found evidence of additional meetings with Soviet intelligence officers at the UN. David continued living in the apartment, maintaining the facade while his life disintegrated. He went to work, conducted analysis, briefed officials, knowing his own work had likely been compromised. Tennant kept him informed through weekly meetings. The Bureau was building a comprehensive case, documenting every element of Catherine's espionage activities. "We're getting close to moving," Tennant told David in mid-December. "We've documented enough to make arrests, but we want to do this carefully. We need Catherine to provide information about her recruitment, her training, what she's passed to Moscow. We're going to arrange a confrontation with you present that we'll monitor. If she believes cooperation is her only option, she may give us intelligence about Soviet operations." David nodded, feeling numb. "When?" "Next week," Tennant said. "We'll brief you on exactly how to handle it. But David, Tennant paused. "This is going to be difficult. Are you ready?" David thought about the baby that wasn't his, about the lies, about classified documents passed to Moscow. He thought about his career, his clearances, his future. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." The FBI's Technical Surveillance Division worked through December, reconstructing Catherine Mitchell's recruitment and operational handling. Special Agent Robert Tennant coordinated the effort from Quantico, where analysts pieced together 18 months of her life, building a timeline that revealed how systematically Soviet military intelligence had penetrated the Defense Intelligence Agency through a honey trap operation disguised as academic exchange. The recruitment had begun in April 1981 at a Russian literature symposium held at Georgetown University's Intercultural Center. Viktor Sokolov had been listed on the program as a visiting research fellow from Moscow State University, specializing in 20th century Soviet literature. His biography was partially true. Sokolov had studied literature in Moscow, but his primary training had been at the GRU Academy, where Soviet military intelligence trained officers in recruitment techniques and long-term penetration operations. FBI investigators obtained the symposium's attendance records. Catherine Russo had attended 3 sessions where Sokolov presented papers on Solzhenitsyn and Soviet dissident movements. Witnesses remembered Catherine asking detailed questions, engaging Sokolov in extended discussions. Several classmates recalled Sokolov seemed particularly interested in Catherine's insights, complimenting her Russian language skills. The symposium had been the initial assessment phase. Sokolov had identified Catherine as a potential recruitment target based on specific criteria: advanced Russian language skills, academic focus on Soviet studies, lack of security clearance, and most critically her marriage to David Mitchell, whose DIA position made him a high-value intelligence target. By mid-December, FBI surveillance teams had identified the DuPont Circle coffee shop where Sokolov and Catherine met regularly. Technical teams installed concealed cameras and audio recording equipment under FISA court authorization. The recordings captured conversations revealing how Sokolov had cultivated the relationship over months, moving from intellectual mentor to confidant to romantic involvement with practiced precision. In one recorded conversation, Sokolov spoke about the importance of mutual understanding between superpowers, framing intelligence sharing as peace-building work that prevented miscalculations triggering nuclear war. He never used terms like espionage or treason. Instead, he described their work as providing context to Soviet analysts, as preventing hawks from misinterpreting defensive preparations as offensive threats. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit identified classic manipulation techniques. Sokolov isolated Catherine psychologically by creating a secret world only they shared, reinforced her importance by praising her intelligence, created dependency through romantic attachment, and gradually normalized passing classified information by framing it as intellectual exchange rather than espionage. Technical surveillance revealed the operational security protocols Catherine had been taught. She varied routes to meeting locations, used payphones for communications, employed basic counter-surveillance techniques. The tradecraft wasn't sophisticated enough to defeat FBI surveillance, but it demonstrated she'd received training, likely from Sokolov during their early meetings. The FBI's most significant breakthrough came from technical analysis of Catherine's home activities. A concealed camera installed in the apartment hallway captured footage showing Catherine entering David's home office at 2:30 a.m., carrying a Minox B camera, the compact German device favored by intelligence services for photographing documents. The footage showed her unlocking David's security case and systematically photographing briefing materials page by page. The FBI cross-referenced dates Catherine accessed David's office with documents he'd brought home. The damage assessment was staggering. Catherine had photographed DIA assessments on Soviet tank divisions, signal intelligence reports on Warsaw Pact communications, NATO strategic planning documents, and human intelligence reports from sources inside Soviet military facilities. The documents were classified secret and top secret. Each photographed document was passed to Sokolov during meetings, hidden inside textbooks or magazines. Sokolov would courier the film to the Soviet embassy, where it was processed and transmitted to GRU headquarters in Moscow via encrypted diplomatic cables. The pregnancy had been an unintended complication. Catherine's romantic involvement with Sokolov had become physically intimate by summer 1981, continuing through David's Germany deployment in August 1982. Intercepted communications between Sokolov and his handlers, decoded by NSA cryptanalysts, revealed the operational crisis the pregnancy created. In one cable dated November 15, 1982, Sokolov reported the pregnancy to his superior, a GRU colonel operating under trade representative cover. The response was harsh. The pregnancy represented unacceptable operational security risk and demonstrated Sokolov's failure to maintain professional boundaries. Moscow Center's directive ordered Sokolov to convince Catherine to terminate the pregnancy immediately. If she refused, he was authorized to sever contact and sacrifice Catherine to protect other networks. Catherine had refused to terminate. FBI surveillance captured a heated argument between them in Rock Creek Park on November 20th. Sokolov pressed her to reconsider, while Catherine, visibly emotional, insisted she would continue the pregnancy regardless. The argument revealed Catherine's psychological state. She'd convinced herself the pregnancy represented something real, a connection transcending the espionage operation. Sokolov's response was cold and professional. He told Catherine she was thinking emotionally rather than strategically, that the pregnancy would inevitably lead to discovery. The conversation ended with Catherine in tears and Sokolov walking away. By mid-December, the FBI had documented everything: recruitment timeline, tradecraft protocols, document photography, communications with handlers, extent of classified information compromised. They had evidence sufficient for prosecution under the Espionage Act. Tennant briefed David on these findings in a secure conference room on December 16th. David sat silent, watching surveillance footage of his wife photographing classified documents, listening to recordings of her discussions with Sokolov about providing context to Soviet analysts. When Tennant finished, David asked only one question. Did she ever love me, or was the entire marriage part of the operation? Tennant considered carefully. The evidence suggests she married you before any GRU contact. The recruitment came later, opportunistically. The marriage was real, the betrayal came after. We're ready to move to the confrontation phase, Tennant said. Are you still willing to participate? David looked at the surveillance photographs. Yes, he said. Let's finish this. The FBI designed the confrontation with clinical precision. Special Agent Tennant briefed David for 2 hours on December 18th, rehearsing exactly how the scene would unfold. The confrontation would occur in the Mitchell apartment on December 20th. FBI technical teams had already installed concealed cameras and audio recording equipment throughout the apartment, turning their home into a surveillance platform. The plan was straightforward, but psychologically brutal. David would present Catherine with the medical records, confront her with the impossible conception timeline, and observe her response. The goal was to break her psychologically, force a confession, and capture her attempting to contact Sokolov using emergency protocols. On the evening of December 20th, David drove home with his heart pounding, rehearsing his opening lines. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, winter settling hard over Washington. He parked in the garage, sat for 5 minutes gathering himself, then walked to the elevator. Catherine was in the kitchen making dinner when he entered. She looked up, smiled, asked about his day. She was 4 months pregnant now, beginning to show. For a moment, David nearly lost his resolve, but he thought about the classified documents photographed at 2:30 a.m., the 18 months of systematic betrayal. "Catherine, we need to talk," David said. "Sit down." Something in his tone made her face change. She turned off the stove and sat at the kitchen table. David sat across from her, pulled the medical records folder from his briefcase, and placed it between them. "I picked up your prenatal care records 3 weeks ago. The conception date listed is August 24th, give or take a few days." Catherine's face went pale. "I was in Germany from August 15th through September 30th, David continued. "I was 4,000 miles away when this baby was conceived. Explain that to me." "David, the dates might be wrong. Medical dating isn't exact. Don't lie to me," David said quietly. "I know about Viktor Sokolov. I know about the meetings, the park, the diner at 2 a.m. I know about the Soviet embassy. I know all of it, Catherine." Her face crumpled. She put her hands over her face and began sobbing. David sat motionless, feeling nothing but cold emptiness. "I'm sorry," Catherine gasped. "I never meant for this to happen. It started as academic discussions. He was so brilliant. And then he told me I could help prevent war by providing context to Soviet analysts. You were passing him classified information," David said flatly. "Documents from my office. He said it was just context, background that would help prevent miscalculations, that I was doing important work for peace." "You were committing espionage," David said, "against your own country, against me." "I didn't think of it like that," Catherine said desperately. "Victor explained it differently. He made it sound noble. And She stopped, crying harder. "I fell in love with him. Or I thought I did. I don't know what was real and what was manipulation." "The baby," David said. "Is it his?" Catherine nodded, unable to speak. David stood, walked to the window, looked out at the December darkness. Behind him, he heard Catherine stand, heard her footsteps moving toward the bedroom. "I need to make a phone call," she said. David turned, watching her. This was the moment Tennant had predicted. Catherine picked up the phone in the bedroom. "I need to speak with Victor. It's urgent. Tell him it's Catherine." There was a pause. "I don't care if he's in a meeting. Get him, now." Another pause. Then, "Victor, it's me. He knows. David knows everything. What do I do?" She stopped, listening. David saw Catherine's face change, saw hope drain away. "You're abandoning me?" Catherine's voice rose. "After everything, you're just—" She listened again, then screamed. "You told me I was helping peace. You said you loved me." She slammed the phone down, collapsed onto the bed. David stood in the doorway. In the surveillance van, FBI agents had captured Sokolov's number, were coordinating to track his location. "Catherine Russo Mitchell," David said quietly. "Federal agents will be here shortly to place you under arrest for espionage." Catherine looked up, her face destroyed. "David, please, there's nothing I can do," David said. 3 minutes later, FBI agents knocked. David opened the door, stepped aside. Special Agent Tennant entered with 2 other agents. Tennant approached Catherine and formally read her Miranda rights. "Catherine Mitchell, you're under arrest for violations of the Espionage Act." Catherine sat motionless as they placed handcuffs on her wrists, as they led her toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." David said nothing. He watched them take her away, listened to their footsteps receding, heard the elevator doors close. Then he stood alone in the apartment, surrounded by FBI surveillance equipment, feeling the complete annihilation of everything he'd built. Outside, other FBI teams were moving toward the Soviet embassy, racing to apprehend Viktor Sokolov. Viktor Sokolov never made it back to the Soviet embassy. FBI agents intercepted him at a safe house in Alexandria 20 minutes after Catherine's arrest. He was detained briefly, interviewed under diplomatic protocols, and ultimately expelled within 72 hours, protected by diplomatic status. On December 23, 1982, Sokolov boarded an Aeroflot flight to Moscow. But FBI surveillance teams monitoring Sokolov's movements made critical discoveries. In the 48 hours following Catherine's arrest, Sokolov attempted to contact 3 other women in Washington. Emergency calls warning them the operation was compromised. FBI technical surveillance captured these calls, providing confirmation of what counterintelligence officials had suspected. Catherine Mitchell wasn't isolated but part of a systematic honey trap network the GRU had been running since 1979. The 3 women were identified rapidly. Susan Kellerman, married to an NSA cryptanalyst. Jennifer Roth, married to a Navy intelligence officer at the Pentagon. Patricia DeMarco, married to a CIA analyst. All had similar profiles: advanced education, Russian language skills, marriages to men with security clearances. All had been recruited through academic or cultural events involving Soviet embassy personnel. The FBI conducted simultaneous raids on December 22nd, arresting all 3 women and seizing evidence: Minox cameras, photographed documents, coded communications materials. The scope was breathtaking: 4 separate honey trap operations running in parallel, each targeting a different intelligence agency. Catherine's case became the focal point because she chose cooperation. On December 27th, from Alexandria Detention Center, Catherine agreed to FBI debriefing sessions. Over 6 weeks, she provided detailed testimony about her recruitment, the tradecraft training, the psychological manipulation, and the full extent of information she'd passed to Soviet intelligence. The debriefings revealed sophisticated architecture. Sokolov reported to a GRU colonel at the Soviet embassy under trade official cover. The colonel coordinated multiple operations, managing handlers who each ran individual assets. The operation had begun in 1979, exploiting vulnerabilities in how American agencies managed spousal access to cleared personnel. Catherine described her training: meetings where Sokolov taught her to photograph documents, vary routes, use payphones, create cover stories. She described the psychological conditioning, constant reinforcement that she was doing piecework, appeals to idealism, construction of a shared secret world, isolating her from normal moral frameworks. The pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during her 3rd week of detention. On January 12, 1983, Catherine experienced severe cramping and bleeding. She was transported to a hospital under guard, where doctors confirmed she'd lost the pregnancy at 16 weeks. Catherine's cooperation earned consideration during sentencing. On April 8, 1983, she pleaded guilty to 4 counts of espionage and was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. She was transferred to Federal Correctional Institution at Alderson, West Virginia. David never attended the sentencing. By April 1983, he'd filed for divorce, a quiet proceeding that dissolved the marriage on grounds of irreconcilable differences. The divorce was finalized in May. David's career survived intensive security review, but the damage was permanent. He was transferred from Soviet military analysis to less sensitive administrative research. His top-secret clearance was reduced to secret. He would never again work on critical intelligence assessments. The classified damage assessment concluded that Catherine and the 3 other women had compromised over 200 classified documents across 3 years. The documents revealed American intelligence on Soviet capabilities, NATO planning, signals intelligence methods, and human sources. Several sources were withdrawn after the compromise. Others weren't reached in time. A CIA source in East Germany went silent in February 1983, likely arrested and executed. Viktor Sokolov returned to Moscow and, according to a 1987 GRU defector, received commendation despite the network's exposure. Soviet military intelligence considered the operation successful. 3 years of intelligence collection, minimal consequences for handlers, valuable lessons about American security vulnerabilities. The other 3 women received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years. All were released between 1995 and 2000. Catherine was released in July 1995, having served 12 years. She returned to Philadelphia, lived quietly with family, worked administrative jobs under her maiden name. She never remarried, never sought public attention. David rebuilt slowly. He remained at DIA until 1990, taking early retirement at 42. He remarried in 1987 to a schoolteacher named Helen with no intelligence connections. They had 2 children, moved to Colorado, lived far from Washington. In 1996, following the Cold War's end, the CIA declassified portions of the operation for intelligence studies. The case became a teaching example, illustrating vulnerabilities in spousal access to classified materials and Soviet recruitment techniques. The 4 women became case studies in how educated people could be manipulated into betraying their countries through appeals to idealism, romantic manipulation, and psychological isolation. In December 2002, 20 years after Catherine's arrest, David received a letter postmarked from Philadelphia. Catherine's handwriting. She wrote that she thought about him often, that she understood he could never forgive her, that she'd spent 20 years trying to understand how she'd allowed herself to be used. She wrote that she'd been young and foolish and convinced herself idealism justified betrayal. She wrote that no day passed without regret. David read the letter once, placed it in a drawer, and never responded. Some betrayals were too fundamental for reconciliation, some damage too complete for healing. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed, but the human wreckage of intelligence operations persisted. The honey trap operation became historical footnote, one of thousands of espionage cases spanning the Cold War. But for those directly involved, David Mitchell, Catherine Mitchell, the 3 other women, their families, it remained the defining event of their lives, the moment when abstract geopolitical conflict became intimate personal tragedy, when the Cold War's machinery consumed individual lives in pursuit of strategic advantage.